Tyler Gabriel here with Dr. Douglas Gabriel, and you are working on a fascinating series about the history of banking. Now, if you are listening to our YouTube videos, you've probably already heard Douglas speak about the Venetian bankers. We did that as a mini-series to get you so that you understood the history of banking. We want to make sure everybody's on the same page. And so now we've got that in the article, and now we report that you've put together, which is amazing. And this is a video introduction to that. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Tyler. It is nice to have the time to be able to work on things like this, because as we have tried to give a perspective for people, to our listeners, that is, about what is happening in the modern times and trying to decloak some of these conspiracies and really find out what are the forces that are operative right now in relationship, of course, to history. Because we're big historians, and of course, that's one of my degrees is history, but that's neither here nor there. The point is that as we're looking at this, you're an economist, and you yourself, as you, throughout your life, even being trained as an economist, this isn't what you were trained. This isn't what is in the history books. This is what you will find when you actually research where the money went, who had the money, who were the people talking to each other, who married who, and so on and so forth. And when you realize that if you trace money back to its origins, that it will explain everything that's in the modern world. And this is really kind of shocking to most people. So people had said to us again and again as they would read our intelligence reports, okay, you've told us about who the military-industrial complex is. You've told us about central banks. You've told us how to win the war with the U.S. Federal Reserve. You've told us about the 100-year plan of Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner and the Round Table and the Pilgrim Society and the Royal Institute for International Affairs. You've told us about the genesis of most of the modern wars based upon warlord bankers and brokers, warmongers, who are politicians. That's usually the warmongers are the politicians, because they're the ones out there making it legal to have war. They vote to go to war. I mean, how can you vote to go kill people? Especially when the genesis of what it was that caused the war could be completely fake based upon bad intelligence. So what we're going to try to describe in this introductory talk is what is about to be explained to you in the intelligence report, which is, who is Mammon? Who is this god of greed, this god of money? Where did he come from? I assume him to be a he. Most demons are. Many demons are. And this god Mammon is in our environment right now. It is so prevalent that we don't even see Mammon. And that's what we're going to explain today. How the history of Mammon and the worship of Mammon has become unconscious and has become the materialism of our modern day age, and humanism and what is called secular humanism.
And also, you begin to understand then the role that human sacrifice and pedophilia plays, because like a lot of patriots, I was not aware of this until a few years ago, and it was shocking to me that this existed at such a prevalence in the world. And then you begin to wonder, how could human beings do this to one another? It has to be something that is certainly not from the angelic realm. And the closer you look, you see a being which you've identified here in your paper as Mammon.
Yes, and in the area where Mammon came to birth, in Mesopotamia in 2000 BC, basically ascribed into law, literally inscribed, carved into stone, the Hammurabi Code, which was carved into stone, and you had to obey it. And you couldn't actually say those things out loud. They were votive stones. So, you couldn't say them to yourself. So when you came upon a votive stone, everyone who could read it, as they would read it, would have to read it out loud, because it was as if the law from above had come down, been carved in stone, and that's the way that it is. And that was the problem. Now, Moloch, this god who is still worshipped to this day, especially by the rich elite for some strange reason, in the Bohemian Grove, people have seen again and again the worship services before the god Moloch. Well, that's when they give a an effigy. They offer up a human life that is an effigy, not a real one, before this god. Because in the times of the Canaanites, when money was basically coming into existence through the temples, as it was supplanting grain, at that same time in 2000 BC, you were having two major transitions going on. One of them is that you were changing from a matriarchal-centered culture with no walls, no war. In fact, if you go back beyond 2000 BC, it's hard to find words for the weapons that are then commonplace in Greek times. There's no walls. The Mycenaean culture was overran because it had no defenses. It had no army. It was a matriarchal culture. And so was Troy. Troy, when Helen was stolen from the Mycenaeans from Agamemnon, brought to Troy, to Ilium, what happened? They built these giant walls to protect her. Well, these were references to the matriarchal transference of culture, or the culture being transferred from the matriarchal to the patriarchal, one that was a non-war culture to a war culture. Now, the war culture came about because there started to be a lot of people on the earth, and people thought it was the thing to do to steal from one another, to steal resources, to become more powerful as a priest king. But at this time, there was a transition from the priestess, who didn't really rule the culture, but the culture was an organic outcropping of the fact that it was a matriarchal culture, especially if you look at the island of Crete. Perfect example. You go into great detail on that, but the Mycenaean culture there on the island of Crete was matriarchal, and we misunderstand it almost completely. All their symbols, their signs, what it was that they believed, we don't understand that, but it was transferred and made completely patriarchal, and war came to exist. That was one thing that happened. The other thing that happened was writing that was then able to be read by many people, not just the hieroglyphs, which were almost a language of the mystery schools, but now writing, which was carved into stones, and the Hammurabi Code, the first laws, so that you change from a matriarchal to a patriarchal culture that does allow war. And in these temples, which were priest king or goddess queen cultures, but let's look at the transition to priest-king cultures. So then you start to see temples. And what do you find in the temples? You find priests. And those priests, like, let's take Egypt, for example. The pharaoh was not the highest priest in the land. It could be, but not necessarily. And the priest, who was building these amazing temples and could understand the language of the hieroglyphs, did not rule the outer world. That was left up to the pharaoh. So there was a priest-king separation at that time. But before that, the priest and king were one. And whatever the priest-king said, that's what everyone else did. So there was just two classes. But there were, in fact, caste systems, and that has now been shown, whether you're in ancient India or ancient Persia, or even the Scythians, or whoever you want to look at, the Celts, there were a certain type of caste system that was involved. So you had the priest-kings, and then you had kind of a caste system, and they all centered around the temple. Well, when the temple became so powerful that the grains that were grown in the land, which is what all life was about at that time, if you didn't have grain, you didn't have life. As a matter of fact, it was the symbol of the Eleusinian mysteries, was to hold up shafts of wheat and to connect them to the sun, saying that the sun's life came into this wheat. And so these kind of mysteries were literally, it was a worship almost of grain. So the temples held the grain, and sometimes, of course, because they wanted everyone to live, they would only be able to build the temple and make it beautiful and do all these amazing things with the temple because of surplus food. So when they had surplus food, they were actually able to loan it out to people, and there started to be a kind of a system of a banking, kind of a grain bank that was going on. And it was absolutely crucial to every single ancient culture. If you did not have the seed for the coming year, then you could die. It was as simple as that. This was a life and death matter. Now, strangely enough, once these temples advanced to the point that they could start to use metals in a way that was kind of superfluous, because Gold and silver, they could be hammered into all kinds of useful things, yes, indeed. But when you're talking about the transition from the Bronze to the Iron Age, you're talking about whether the weapons were strong enough. When you got Iron Age weapons, they made the Bronze Age weapons completely, basically useless. So the transference of consciousness through metals is a very key factor. So when silver and gold, or even rougher metals, were brought into the temple and they were stamped with the image of the god or goddess of the temple, they were then used inside of the temple to basically run these magical devices. And as they would put a coin in, then they would get the water for their oblations, things like that. Or they would make temple offerings, and the grain could be actually exchanged for these coins as a representation of the grain. It was an easier way than handling a shekel of grain, which was 180 barley kernels, things like that. So they became standardized, and they also became exchanged in the temple as well as used in the temple. But when those coins left the temple, and when the temple, the money changers came into the temple to change what then would become the money of the common people into the money of the temple, because they didn't want to mix them, because one was sacred and the other one was not. It was very crude. And the ones that were used by the common people were of base metal, and they were not weighed, and they weren't stamped, and so on and so forth. So you often see this in many of the ancient renditions of the way that it was. I was just watching a movie the other night. Everyone had iron ringed chains on them. Those are actually coins.
Yes, that's where they held their money, and that's why they had holes in them. But let's move along and see where does this lead us, because what we're really here is to help educate folks so that we understand what we need to do to take down the Federal Reserve.
Well, when we separated money and allowed coinage of metals and paper, fiat currency, to represent human labor, because that's what the grain represented, human labor, which was offered up to the gods. The greatest thing that we have is our love, is our effort, is our willpower. And that's what was being offered to the gods. At the end of the year, when you had your harvest and your bounty, you shared it with the gods who were good enough to give you the rains and the sunshine and what you needed. So you lived in a symbiotic relationship with nature, but you used your temple as a way to not only express your gratitude and to center your cultural life around, your religious life around, but also it became a bank. So the first temples were banks. So when the priest-king was separated from, at the same time that the temple was separated from grain and coinage, that is when evil was born. Because the being of Mammon is the demon of greed, one of the 7 deadly sins, and one of the worst, because there is no satiating greed, and no matter what, you could have trillions of dollars and you'd still want tens of trillions, and then you'd want hundreds of trillions. You cannot in any way ever satiate greed. And because greed is so common because of jealousy and envy and avarice and covetousness, these things are the most basic common reality when the human being wakes up and looks at their neighbor and says, hey, wait a second, they have more than I do. So when the people in Babylon woke up and said, hey, wait, they have a nicer house. Well, if I went and I went to the banksters, and these were banking families who worked outside of the temple to give you loans with interest. And the Hammurabi Code protected these people. As a matter of fact, in the end, if you owed them money, they could put you in jail, debtor's prison. So debtor's prison came when the law, Hammurabi Code, the law, started to impress upon the civil society what couldn't be done out of sheer love and gratitude and working through the temple, like the temple did, and the temple was structured to do to begin with. But when it went awry, and these banking families became as powerful as temples, as powerful as kings and queens, they started to own land, and then they started to give interest put interest on loans, as well as handle literally the land, the real estate of the king would be handled by these bankers and these banking families. So there were only a few banking families, about a half a dozen of them in Babylon, but they ruled everything. And they ruled everything for a long, long time. And when they went down, the only reason they went down is because they transferred then into the next culture that came to rise. And that kept happening. So from Babylon through the Levant, through Phoenicia, through the Mediterranean islands, into Greece, and then almost simultaneously into Venice and Constantinople. And those are the ones that we focused on in our presentations. These central bankers who took what should have been the kingdom of some religious pope or religious ruler and turned it into a civil society, a city-state, what the Greeks called a polis. And they, in fact, ruled as a republic. And these families that ruled were surrounded by other families that were families of oligarchs. And this has been the same thing going on. So it was passed down from the worship of Mammon, from the moment that money started to be used. Any time people used it unconsciously, the demon of Mammon got bigger. So when the humanists were closed down in Constantinople, and also then at the same time Venice was faltering, they moved into Europe, particularly through northern Italy, and then into Switzerland, and then specifically into Germany, and then into Holland, and then in England, and then they spread. And of course England still thinks that America is its Commonwealth nation and that they still control us, and through the U.S. Federal Reserve they basically do. But you have to look very closely to see who these families are, because they have interbred. Now, the worship of Mammon is basically materialism. Humanism is to say, as you said so beautifully the other day, Tyler, it limits the whole view of the world to nothing but the human. There's nothing divine. There's no angels or archangels or anything divine, anything above. No, just humans. That means you have one life, and you better grab what you can. That's the thought of the greedy person. And then the path of perdition of the 7 deadly sins will take any addict right up to the moment of death, and they'll still be desiring to be more miserly and greedy. So the people who were in these powerful positions, these banking families, they didn't send their children to war, but they were the bankers behind the wars. Matter of fact, they fomented the wars. They created the dissent, and they used their intelligence agencies. So banking and intelligence.
And don't forget news, because you've got Reuters and AP, and they're all tied into the banksters.
That's exactly right. The Rothschilds bought, or Reuters started on its own, but then Rothschilds bought it, and it became their number one propaganda tool for manipulation of the markets. And that's how the Rothschilds in the 19th century basically were as powerful as for hundreds of years before that the Fuggers and the Welsers were in Germany, and they were an Italian family from the Estes family, Diesta, and they kept marrying into these other banking families. And as they changed from nation to nation, you now have Rothschilds who were actually German Jews who had, no one really knows their true beginning, but they came up through the areas of the Lombards and through northern Italy. And what you're talking about is deceit. Because if you're going to be a greedy worshiper of Mammon, and remember, everything you do is your religion. Whatever you do the most, that is your religion. Whatever you think the most, that is your religion. And people don't understand this. So if you spend 75% of your waking day being an automaton, getting the money that you need to survive, and I literally mean, even in America, the land of the supposed to be, capitalism and home of the brave and the free, and everybody's wealthy. No, most Americans spend the majority of their life, or much, much more than that, sometimes 100% of their life, simply surviving. If that's the case, then you're a debt slave. And who are you a debt slave to? To the U.S. Federal Reserve. We owe $22 trillion to the U.S. Federal Reserve. Now, it's not U.S., it's not federal, and it has no reserves. They'll tell you that we the people own it. That is a lie. It is so complicated that I would have to speak for 20 minutes on the structure of the U.S. Federal Reserve, because it is a deceit. They say that it is a private corporation, and it is. but it is underwritten by U.S. tax dollars, sometimes to the tune of billions and billions of dollars a year. In fact, the U.S. Federal Reserve turns around and gives a bill to the U.S. Congress, and up until a few years ago, that bill was simply paid without any thought, without any debate whatsoever, because of some belief that the U.S. Federal Reserve creates our monetary policy, which is complete caca. Why would we allow the biggest national security issue in America, our economy, to be controlled by a corporation? That is a lie. They have nothing to do with our monetary policy. They are the megaphone. They speak for the U.S. Treasury, the Plunge Protection Team, and especially the Exchange Stabilization Fund, and many other groups that are part of the U.S. Treasury. So the central banks that started literally all the way back at the time of Venice and the beginnings of the First Crusades, where the really solid republic became the ruler of the central bank, and that the head of that, the Doge, this tutelary head, this almost king, but he's a king without, he has all the trappings, but he has none of the power, because there's multiple committees around him, and I mean multiple committees, of all the richest oligarchs and bankers and brokers and warmongers. And as I say, they don't send their children to war. They send other people's children to war, and they don't go to war themselves in most cases. So this is the Republic, and the Republic controls the money. And as you go off to fight these wars, remember that the Venetians and the Medici and other Italian bankers were allowed by the Pope to do business with the Turks and with the Muslims in the Levant. In other words, both sides of the war. So the Venetians, who were given the money by the Pope to outfit the First Crusades, also was allowed to trade with the enemy of the Crusaders and to be their bankers at the same time, and this is how it's been going ever since. Now, that duplicity is because you believe that the only thing there is this life right now, and for your children and your family, you're going to grab all the wealth you can, and you're going to create a dynasty, and it's going to be secret, and you're going to marry in until the names are so changed that you don't know that the Italians are actually have married into all of the British elite. The landed gentry and the highest of the richest elite in Britain are actually married into Italian banking families, who might have come from Holland or from Germany. It depends. Might have come from Switzerland or northern Italy. It just depends. But the point is it's the same concepts where banking families become dynasties that are as powerful as monarchies.
And here's something I just want to remind people, is that your elites and all the people you've just described, they are taught real history in their private schools. And then the rest of us out here in America, in our Common Core required courses, we're taught propaganda history. So this is why you're walking around and maybe hearing what Thomas says for the first time, thinking, why didn't I learn this in school? That's because it was propaganda history. And it's time to awaken. We've awakened to fake news, and now we're going to awaken to fake history.
You have said that perfectly, Tyla, because we've been talking about Rhodes Scholars.
Yes.
Don't trust a single one of them. Why? Because they are taught this type of British Anglo-American alliance imperialism that was created from the Dutch and British East India companies that basically were at war with the Germanic Hanseatic League that were the first traders using Portuguese and Spanish traders. And it was a gigantic war. Well, hello, that's the same exact people fighting World War I and II.
And this is the history that a Rhodes Scholar like Bill Clinton would know.
Oh, absolutely.
You see? And that's his truth history. And then the rest of us down here don't have a clue of what the British and the Dutch East India companies have to do with anything.
Rhodes Scholars were taught to be Marxists and communists, and that's what Rhodes says. But for the sake of the ruling class, and the ruling class is Anglo-American, English, as it were, British, the United Kingdom. And we're the only ones who have the right to rule. But he said that he had to have America as part of it. And then, look what they did. They propagandized America for World War I and II, and for Korea, and all the other wars. The communists and the Marxists and the fascists were going out to fight. That's Cecil Rhodes and Alfred Milner and the Round Table and the Pilgrim Society and Chatham House and the Royal Institute for International Affairs and the Council on Foreign Relations. That's who that is. They are the communists. They are the Marxists, the cultural Marxists. Literally, they'll tell you they're of the Frankfurt School, that literally they're of Tavistock.
Look at anything written by Saul Alinsky.
Absolutely. And it's outright clear that the rich elite believe that they need to cull the masses and make sure that they steal from them the flow of money that they have, the majority of it, at least 50%, and they want to put that into a place where they don't have to pay taxes, and that is what offshore accounts are, and that's what we live in now, and that's what central banks do, and that's why there's debt in every nation to a central bank. And then they say, oh, the Rothschilds, they don't own those banks. No, but they're one of the largest banks. At one point, they owned all the ones that were in existence at that time, but not now. What they own now are share and asset management companies that have changed their name 10 times so that you don't know that it's a Rothschild, a Rockefeller, a Warburg, a Loeb, a Kuhn, or any of the other ones, a Morgan, or any of the other ones who are clearly these banking dynasty families I'm talking about, who absolutely worship money. They're materialists. They're humanists, they're secular humanists. They believe in science, which is nothing more than another pathetic, really pathetic mythology, and they believe in eugenics.
Douglas, what do you hope people will walk away with after they read the citizen intelligence reports and look at your lessons on Venetian banking? What's the takeaway here?
Well, I'm so glad that you asked that, Tyler, because as you know, I worked on this for quite some time.
Yes, I do know that.
Maybe longer than anything.
It was very important for you to finish this, yes.
Maybe longer than anything I've worked on, right? Well, the reason we were able to, because we have a lull now, because we predicted everything that's happening in the geopolitical realm here in America and the rest of the world. And we're just sitting back on our laurels, eating our cheesecake, drinking our cappuccino, saying, we were right. Now, so I said, oh, wait, Michael McKibben and his researchers in Americans for Innovation and your team and the Conclave all had revealed the 100-year plan of Cecil Rhodes. Because I kept saying, when all of this would come out, well, you just go back to Cecil Rhodes. And they'd all look at me like, why do you keep saying that? So when we did, oh my gosh, you saw what poured out. So much information about Cecil Rhodes and the Round Table to prove what is generally considered a conspiracy when it is not a conspiracy, that at that point, people were so thrilled by that we said, we need to go from Cecil Rhodes all the way back to the beginning, and we to the basically to the Bank of the Bank of England, and then to the City of London, and then to the Vatican Bank, Venetian bankers, the German bankers, Dutch bankers, Dutch East India Company, and all the way back to Babylon.
Michael McKibben said, are you going to take me back to the Hammurabi Code? And indeed, we did.
I forgot that. That's right. He did say that. That's very funny. Yes. Sorry, Michael.
Okay, so the takeaway is that this is history, and history continues to flow in the course of time and space, whether you are in your incarnation or not. And if you're taught propaganda history and fed fake news, you don't see the full and larger picture. And that's what you're showing here. You're actually showing us the outlines of a being called Mammon.
Yes, and I'm basically saying that virtue always wins over vice in the long run. In the short run, oh yes, here in this material world, you may see that the very wealthy seem to live for a long time, have a beautiful life, and blah, 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 but I believe in karma. So they're going to get theirs. And anyway, if you believe in virtue, you're not even caught up in that. And if you have knowledge and consciousness, then you can see what's going on and you can just laugh. That's the reason so often I just laugh and say, oh no, it's so very easy. It's so very easy. Here's my plan. Oh, here's my plan now. I just made it up. Okay, here's a new plan. Let's get 500,000 people, just like they just had 500,000 people marching in Europe. Let's get 500,000 people to surround the U.S. Fed, fire them, and make so much news that we say that until every single politician says that they will vote to default on the U.S. Fed, we're not going to vote for them. We'll have a revolution like they have in France, but not against Macron and the globalists and his bunk buddy, Angela Merkel, the political daughter of George Soros and Open Borders, the big friggin' liar that she is. No, we are going to have a second American Revolution, and it's not going to be against America. It's going to be against America's enemies, and America's number one enemy now is the one who swears that we owe them $22 trillion when we don't owe them one dime. First off, it's odious debt. So you can bankrupt on odious debt. Matter of fact, it's bankruptcy without having any payments. We don't have to pay anything to them. Now remember, I'm going to say something to you that's going to shock you. Every 4 to 5 years, the Fed comes and gives the U.S. Congress a $25 billion bill. No one knows this. No one talks about it. Last time they did this, they only gave them $4.5 billion. And since then, the Fed has been in a war with Capitol Hill and the White House. They thought that they were going to take down by going to zero or sub-zero interest rates, right? Like the rest of the world. In other words, go into negative currency? That's not even possible. That's stupid. Now what are they doing? Raising the rates for Trump 8 times in the shortest period of time in the Fed's history, in a war against Trump because he brought the economy back. The Fed is our enemy. The second that we rise up in a revolution against them, we will basically say to Mammon, you will not keep us as automatons in a debt enslavement trap here in America. We do not owe any foreign powers, and by the way, the major owners, shareholders of the U.S. Federal Reserve are foreigners. Same thing with our industrial military complex. Same thing with our Fortune 500. Same thing with Serco and the Crown agents. The same people get USAID, which is $86 billion a year. Same exact people, foreigners, not Americans. So all we have to do is have a revolution against, let's just take the Brits out of our country, get the Brits out because they are thick as thieves in the U.S. Federal Reserve, and take down the U.S. Federal Reserve. And at that moment, there will no longer need to be any more income tax. We'll simply pay a flat tax when anyone, including the rich or corporations, buy anything. They pay a tax.
Or a sales tax.
A sales tax.
Yeah.
That's it. Simple, flat old tax.
Right.
Across the states, all the same. No change. Guess what? You'll have more money than you want. And if that doesn't give you enough money, put a 0.0001 cent tax on the 1.6 quadrillion traded, tax-free on the New York Stock Exchange, and that doesn't include the Chicago and the New York commodities or any of the other stock exchange, and of course stop all derivatives. And if you stop all derivatives and derivative swaps in buying long and short, then the gambling ends. And the whole thing falls apart. And if you take back the money, don't allow any money into offshore accounts unless it's paid its taxes first, and stop all offshore accounts, you would have so much money that America would not know what to do with it. It was like, how did Trump go from being...
The government would pay us as citizens.
That's correct.
We would have unbelievable services.
We'd be like Venezuela.
Yes.
We'd have the higher form of true... there's not even a name for it. It hasn't been created, where we really take care of everybody. Because why? In 2 years, Trump went from being, we have no oil, to we are the number one producer and we're selling to everybody. We're actually sticking it down their throats. How is that possible? Because the Brits, through British Petroleum and Dutch Shell, were stealing all our offshore drilling because Obama said we can't do it, and we let the foreigners come in and do it. Same thing with Lockheed Martin. Same thing with BAE. Same thing with SAIC. Same thing with all of it. It all goes back to Chatham House rules being used for the military-industrial complex in the Highlands Forum Group. The Highlands Forum, which is where basically internationally the big money is spent, where the Raytheons and the Lockheed Martin and the BAE and the others are all making the big decisions that make us little people so small, because those are international deals. And they were gutting America. And now Trump has come to show us it's been gutted. And what we need to do is simply realize consciousness is what changes things. We need to reach a critical mass of consciousness. Just like the theory of atomic explosion It starts off with just a couple, and then it creates a chain reaction. Well, that's what we do in the media, in the alternative media, on the internet, and we have to use this weapon that they created because it got out of control, and we need to use it to our advantage before there is no more free speech whatsoever in America. So what do we do for Mammon? Oh, easy. Ignore Mammon. Do not let money control your life. Realize that your money is a representation of the stored value of your effort. And if you're doing what you love, who cares about the money? And the money will come. It's as simple as that. Stop worshiping money. Worship what you do. Make what you do, not money. Make what you do your own virtuous advancement, your own personal development, whether it be through higher thinking, through your own creativity, whatever it is you wish to express yourself as. So don't let Mammon get you. Now, there are things that you can't help in this world, but one thing you can stop is you can either serve God or you can serve Mammon, and that's up to you.
Folks, if you are looking at this on YouTube, if you go into the description box, go to the link, and I have the full article there, and also included in that are the 4 mini lessons we did on Venetian banking. Douglas, thank you so much.
Tyler, thank you for coming up with this and really helping create the genesis of the idea and planting the seed that made me realize that unless we explain this extremely complicated thing, which I'm not sure what's going to be 100 pages, and 4 articles of the 4 greatest historian economists that I know of, and all that we did, when you get that, then you have that seed, you have that ability to have the frame around the picture, and everything else falls into place. You'll go, that? Oh, well, let's check who they're married to. Oh, look at that. Well, let's see if they're on the Privy Council. Looky there.
Are they a Rhodes Scholar?
I mean,
really, everything falls into place.
It falls into place. You just go, got it. Okay, well, we know what they're going to do next then. Well, how do you know what they're going to do next? It's what they've always been doing for thousands of years. There's nothing new. These aren't inventive people. They're clever, but they are not wise, and they will never be wise. So we need to have the wisdom gained from the consciousness of looking at history properly and really seeing the effective elements of history and not believing what the Toynbees and the Will Durants tell us, because, believe it or not, they were part of the British propaganda group of Jeremy Bentham and later the Round Table. So don't believe the history books. Go for the real facts yourself. Do your own search and find what you need in this day and age.